Okay. Okay. Well, on behalf of Gender Ideal, I'd like to welcome everyone. I'm Flory Wilson. I am the founder and CEO of Gender Ideal. I'm delighted to have you join us for the first of 10 LinkedIn Live series. This series will explore the concepts that are covered in the Ideal 12 assessment. And the purpose of the series is to equip organizations with the insights they need to build a business case inside their organizations for why they should implement these practices and to have the fundamentals to begin the work of how to implement these practices. Links to these videos and additional interviews and resources can be found on the resources page of our website. This series has been developed to support the Ideal 12 campaign, which was launched in March of 2022, and is designed to be a first step for companies to benchmark their performance on 12 core practices that have impact on gender equity in the workplace. Upon submission of the Ideal 12, companies receive a score out of 12 points and have access to benchmark reports and are committed and are encouraged to commit either to making progress on one of those 12 practices covered in the Ideal 12, or for companies that earn close to 12 points, we encourage them to continue on to take the full Gender Ideal assessment, which is a thorough and holistic evaluation of a company's gender performance. You can learn more on our website, www.gender-ideal.org. And we encourage everyone on the call to participate in taking the Ideal 12 on behalf of your organization. One other note before we jump into the conversation, we want this to be useful and interactive for our audience. We encourage you to use the comment section in LinkedIn to ask questions and to add to our dialogue. And we will reserve several minutes at the end of this conversation for audience Q&A. And so with that, let's get started. I am really looking forward to our conversation today with Julia Dow. Julia currently serves as the Vice President of Compensation Services at Opencomp, a software company that empowers high-growth companies to get compensation right and pay employees fairly. Using trusted market data, planning, analytics, and professional consultation in one complete platform, Opencomp simplifies compensation planning. Julia joined Opencomp when it spun out of Connery Consulting in January of 2021 and has worked with companies like Discord, Reddit, Medium, and Figma. Previously, Julia was a senior compensation consultant at Connery Consulting, and before that, Julia held various compensation roles at multinational corporations, including Visa and Raytheon. She is truly an expert in this topic. So let's go ahead and dive in. Julia, tell us why doing pay equity analyses is so important for an organization. Are there any risks in not doing a pay equity analysis, and are there specific benefits that you want to highlight?
Yeah, so probably both on either side. I think one of the main reasons why it's so important is one, it's really the topic that's going around everywhere, and it's at the top of everyone's mind. And so one, if you do one regularly, it helps to get those processes in check so that you always have fair and equal pay or are striving for it. It also helps build trust with employees. It helps with their engagement, and then ultimately brings more productivity to the workforce. As far as risks, there's of course the legal ones, but there's also unmotivated workforces that might not trust their employer. They might think that they don't have any clarity or transparency into whatever process or whether they're even paid fairly. And so it almost distracts against the work that they could be doing, and it kind of builds a sentiment around a company. So those are kind of risks, benefits. Benefits, we pretty much touched on a lot of them, but when you think about a regular cadence of doing pay equity checks, it helps you make sure there aren't any unforeseen costs. So the first time you do one, you might have a huge expense because you haven't been consistent in your offer processes or in your promotion processes. And so there's larger gaps that need to be solved for. But if you start to get in a regular cadence of doing one, it also helps you kind of stay on track throughout the process so that you're not always having to make huge changes to pay.
Great. We're going to get into the mechanics of how to start doing a pay equity assessment, but I don't want to move off the topic. You mentioned getting into a regular cadence.
Yeah.
How frequently should companies do a pay equity analysis? What I'm sensing is this is not like a one and done scenario. So tell us a little more about cadence.
Yeah, so most companies probably opt to do one every year, annually, and a lot of times they try to do that in conjunction with their compensation planning process. So whenever they're looking at making mass changes of compensation for the organization, they also take that opportunity to see if there's any gaps that they need to close with that budget or with that process, so that it is a smooth compensation increase conversation with any employee. So usually then I think if you're looking at changing pay for an employee population, sometimes companies do mid-year reviews, sometimes they do out-of-cycle promotions. Those are always opportunities to take a look at your internal equity and make sure that things are being balanced, whatever you're proposing. So I would typically recommend at least annually, but if you have more frequent compensation processes, you always want to have some type of check in there.
Okay, great. Okay, so let's back up a little bit and talk about how can an organization get started doing this work? Who needs to buy into this process? And what data do companies need to have in hand or start collecting? And are there other systems that need to be in place to get started?
Yeah, so let's start with the employee data. So that's some of the hardest part of making sure your data is clean, making sure you have all gender and race data filled out, making sure your HRIS system is clean with any other credentials that you might want to track, like degrees, years of experience. You also want to make sure that whatever pay ranges or benchmark data that you might be using to do this pay equity audit are validated, the most up-to-date versions, all of that. And then you also want to make sure that any promotion or performance information that you might want to use as well is pulled in and readily available. The other thing I'd also say is that a lot of times companies do negotiate, right? And so, or they might have to extend offers that are outside of their regular parameters. And so having documentation for negotiations, for why you might have made an exception for a candidate, are really crucial, so that you can always point back to that if anything comes up in a pay audit, to say, oh, this person's way above, but here's why, and this was a conscious decision. So that's kind of all the items that you need. Tracking for these varies from company to company, because sometimes they have HRIS systems, sometimes they're using spreadsheets. So it really just depends. But that's pretty much the data process. The buy-in process. Ideally, this is coming from your senior leadership, right? They care about employees being paid fairly and equitably. And so you have that support from the beginning, ideally. And they also know that there might be a cost involved, so that you have that financial sponsor as well. Then you also are likely going to have managers that are involved, because they're communicating any increases or giving you any input on why an employee might be paid the way that they are. And then you also want to make sure that you have your legal support, whether that's your internal GC or your external employment counsel, because they're going to be crucial in this process as well.
Great. Can you talk more about that legal support? I think that's something that when you and I were talking before this call, as someone who doesn't sit in an HR role, that was new information for me. So I'd love to hear more about what does that counsel, what is their involvement in the process? What support do they provide?
Yeah, so usually we like to include them from the beginning of providing any type of results to an organization if we're doing a pay equity audit. We always want to make sure that the information that we provide is privileged, so that they are able to advise on what is the norm, because they have more access to case files or anything like that, on what remedial steps might be if something arises that seems to need some type of corrective action. And so you always want to make sure that is covering you from an organizational standpoint, so that if there are any changes that need to be made, they could really advise you on the best legal route to go.
Got it. And when you say corrective action, you're talking about, hey, this person is underpaid relative to their peers. We need to. Yeah. Okay. So your legal counsel is always going to be involved in that process.
Correct. Yeah.
Or
should be. Yeah. Ideally.
Got it. Okay. Okay. So you've helped kind of paint the landscape. Actually, one little clarifying question. You said senior leadership really needs to be bought in. Have you ever engaged with a company where senior leadership wasn't bought in? And did you have to kind of have you played that advocacy role? And would you have advice for others on if they are trying to make the case for why their organization should do a pay equity analysis, kind of how they should approach it with their senior leadership?
Yeah. So I've been fortunate. Anybody who comes to us wants to purchase our services to conduct a pay equity audit. So there's automatic buy-in right from there on that standpoint of saying, we know as an organization, this is something we want to pursue. And I've worked at very awesome companies that really care about pay equity. So fortunately, I haven't had to struggle too much with getting that done, but there are some points that are from a business perspective that makes sense on why a company would want to get one done. And one, again, it's making sure there aren't any unforeseen costs and being able to budget for those appropriately. Because if you do something, say something comes up and you have to dig in and there's actually some really big gaps that you have to close, that could be an expense that the business hasn't allotted for in their annual operating plan. They also, again, productivity and the employee experience totally pays tenfold if an employee is engaged and not having to worry about whether there's unfairness and then kind of the perception gets spread throughout other areas of the organization, because that can be a huge cultural change as well if employees are feeling that way. And then if you're doing regular audits, this allows you to budget for something. So you understand that, hey, this much might be spent this year, or on average, this much is spent, or we might have to take some of our merit budget away to fund any gaps versus making this an incremental cost. So I would really speak to kind of the business cases for it. And usually that helps permeate any obstacles that leadership might be throwing up.
Great. Okay. That's super helpful. So now we'll assume we've got buy-in to do this process. We have tracked the data. It's either in a spreadsheet or it's in an HR system, database. So walk us through, we've got our council on board. They're ready to be involved. Walk us through then the next steps. Who is involved? How long does it typically take an organization to get through the process? Love to hear your experience. I know you've worked with a variety of companies sizes on this. So yeah.
So timeline will definitely be dependent on data cleanliness, budgeting, the size of the organization. So I've seen it range from taking like 6 weeks to taking several months just to get all of the ducks in a row. But once you get all of your data and your employees mapped to whatever you want to compare them to, whether it's internal averages or the market data, ideally you have ranges that you're comparing them to and looking at what we call compa ratios. So the employee's salary against a midpoint of a range and understanding who's high and who's low, where the different gender averages lie. And so there's a few different ways that you can do pay equity analyses. For smaller companies, it's typical, or smaller to mid-sized companies, really, if you don't have a concentrated amount of employees in a specific job and level, it might be closer to what we call a cohort analysis, where you're doing a manual comb through of looking at who's below an average compa ratio and seeing what happened there and why they might be so far below any of their peers. The most defensible one for court reasons is a regression analysis. And that is mathematical, and it takes into account a ton of different factors to provide a trend line that pretty much says, okay, your females or males are below this average trend line, and therefore there is a gap that exists that you need to start correcting for. In the middle, there's kind of an average pay ratio that you still account for with the range. So when we think about having a compensation range, this should be adjusting for factors of like scope of role, the requirements needed to complete that role. So that really takes into account, it kind of levels the playing field and speaks to that adjusted comp ratio versus an unadjusted, which might be, hey, all of our females in an organization have X pay and all of our males have this pay. It doesn't account for type of role or anything like that. So really using a range or a compensation benchmark helps put that into perspective. So when you look at that, it's the average pay against whatever data source that you are using and seeing who is below that average and again, why a gap exists.
Okay, so I think, let me just say back to you what I think I heard, and you can correct me. There are a variety of methods, but some of those methods use external data. So compensation from industry benchmarks, not just looking at data from inside that particular organization. Did I get that right?
Yeah, correct. And it depends on their compensation framework. So some companies use raw market data for their pay bands, if we want to call them that. So, or they have created pay ranges where it does take external data, but they've made it reflective of their compensation philosophy. And therefore that's what they're comparing it to. But either way, you want to take a look at like what is competitive for that role and that level versus just saying, hey, what is the average of all female salaries versus the average of all male salaries? Because that takes out a lot of the context and detail from pay.
That's super helpful. And then you also mentioned one of the best methods is to do a regression analysis. How many employees does a company need? How much data do you need to use that approach? Is that typically for larger companies? Could a small business use that approach as well?
It's typically for larger companies. Yeah, so you probably want to be in the thousands of employees, and depending on if you have, because you still need a good amount of a sample size in like an individual level and role. Most of the companies that we deal with are smaller, and so that can't apply to them because they don't have that statistical relevance to any of the data. So you have to do a cohort analysis.
A cohort analysis. Okay, that's great. Tell us a little bit more then about how Opencomp works. I know this is a new tool. You spun it out of a consulting firm that has had a focus and a practice on compensation. So how is Opencomp trying to bring novel approaches to doing compensation and pay equity analyses?
Yeah, so first and foremost, we want to get reputable data into the hands of employers so that they can make educated decisions on pay versus this is what a candidate is asking for. This is what a negotiation has looked like for this candidate, and therefore that's what they received. So we really try to start from the beginning of what we would call a compensation roadmap. So starting with a competitive analysis of taking your roles and comparing them to the market data to understand what percentile you're paying at on average for cash, equity, et cetera. And then the platform allows you to then model out different compensation philosophy scenarios. So say that you want to target the 75th percentile of the market for pay. It allows you to then shift that, understand cost, understand how far your employees are from that target that we want to look at. And then once you understand that target, it helps you be more consistent with going to market with offers. So you know that as a company, we are targeting X percentile of the market, and this is what an offer would look like for this candidate, no matter what gender they are, right? And so we have that aspect of it. And then we also have a DE&I planning tool to where you can see gaps by gender and by ethnicity and both on how your employees are stacking up against the market from those perspectives. Also the average level, which I typically geek out on. So you could see that, oh, hey, none of our female populations are able to have an average level above a level 3. So do we have issues with promoting into higher level roles? Do we not recruit at these higher levels for females as well? So what does that really look like? And then we have throughout our whole platform really the ability to overlay gender and ethnicity. So like even that market analysis on comparing to market, you can always filter by those so that you have a really good sense of what that internal labor market looks like when you go to the external labor market. So we're really trying to start with making sure there's information symmetry between employers and candidates, right? Because ultimately both want to pay fairly, to provide value to both the employee and the employer relationship. And so ideally getting more reputable data out there is going to continue to compound and add to that integrity in the market.
Got it. Well, and it sounds like it also helps identify, patterns around promotion and representation across the organization that's really important, right? So
Yeah.
It's not what are we paying today and who's getting how much, but really looking at these patterns, across the organization's workforce.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, when you think about the time it might take to do an analysis like that and benchmark and level a lot of our roles. So the nice part is we have machine learning and AI that does a lot of that benchmarking and leveling for you so that you're starting from something versus having to a lot of other data sources. There's a submission process where you have to kind of start with these other sources and start matching. And it's a very labor intensive process. So we're really trying to speed that up so that people can get to the actions versus having to spend time in a whole bunch of spreadsheets doing an analysis that a platform can do for you.
Yep. And what's the target either industry or organization size for Opencomp? Or is it a useful tool for any size business in any industry?
So right now our kind of sweet spot is private companies that are typically VC backed. So startups, pre-IPO. And really that's because a lot of these companies might not have a compensation person in-house. So we're really trying to take compensation best practices and put it into a platform so that HR folks or CFOs or founders can really get down to just, again, executing and being action oriented. Mm-hmm. So really our demographic is really series from seed to series D, E, but mostly series A to C is kind of our sweet spot.
Okay, that's great. Okay, so I'm going to pull us back now for just a moment. We've talked about how to build a business case to do a pay equity analysis. Then we've talked about the how, the data that's needed. So now let's say we're at the end. What happens? You've done the analysis. Let's say things look pretty good overall, but maybe there have been some inconsistencies that have been identified. What happens then?
Ideally, you understand the corrections that you need to make and plan for them in a budget and implement them in the comp planning process of your company. Some companies do it in a different cycle, but really they prefer to do it in cycle with the comp planning process because then there doesn't have to be a separate call out conversation of, hey, there was likely a disparity in what you were hired to do and a gap, or what you were hired at pay wise and the rest of the organization. So you're able to have an easier conversation with that employee, hopefully. And then again, the company can budget for it. If there's increases where the company can't do the full adjustment that they need to, you can do that over a period of time. But I would just advise working with your lawyer to understand what that ideal time period would be.
And one of the questions that has come in through LinkedIn, can you talk about transparency in this process? What is the organization's kind of responsibility or what's the best practice in terms of being transparent about this back with your employees? How do employers handle that, or how should they?
Yeah, so some companies disclose at the end of a process, hey, we have done a pay equity audit and these were our results. Some companies just do corrections and they don't necessarily talk about all of that. I say transparency, there isn't necessarily a best practice in that because it does depend on organization and the education that the employee base and the managers have around any compensation element. So some companies are not very transparent at all. And so talking about pay equity audits and the results of them is just going to probably cause more of an uproar. And so I always recommend kind of easing into a transparency spectrum. So starting with any training that you need to do around just compensation in general and understanding how people are paid the way they are in the organization. What are your values around compensation? Really getting down to that compensation philosophy and which guides all of your compensation decisions. Then training managers on how to talk about compensation with employees. And then we start moving into, hey, we've done pay equity audits. We plan to evaluate this annually. Our females make X amount for every male. You'll see some of the big companies that do announce very explicit results, but usually those results are like they're paying 99 cents on the dollar, right? It's really a good news story. And so most companies, I think if there is a gap that they're working to close, they might hold off on some of the details for a while until they get to a better standing.
And what about as it relates to an individual perhaps who's been identified as underpaid? I mean, is it a best practice for HR to say, Susan, we're giving you a 20% pay raise because it turns out you were underpaid? Or is it just we're giving you a raise but not providing the context? How do most companies handle that?
Most companies, again, if it's in a compensation planning cycle, just deliver the news of, hey, this is your new increase, and they probably just say based on performance and your role, we want to pay you X amount. If there's a separate process that is very apparent that it's not a comp planning process, most companies will say, yes, we did a broader pay equity analysis, and this was likely in that analysis on any correction. So some do, and there are sources out there on surveys that have published kind of what most companies do around this.
Okay. We have 5 minutes left, and 2 more questions or topics I want to cover. The first is, obviously we've talked about looking at this data through the lens of gender. You have mentioned race. What are the best practices for companies in terms of how should they be gathering that information? How should they track it? And I guess a related question is, beyond segmenting based on gender, race, have you been involved in studies maybe where they've looked at sexual orientation, ability, et cetera? And so if you can talk about, again, what maybe other identity characteristics are that can be used in a pay equity analysis, and also though how that data would get tracked.
Yeah, so a lot of race is typically obviously tracked through EEO reporting a lot of times. And so most companies will need to have this kind of data, at least in that format, if they're at a certain size. So I would recommend tracking it from that. There are optional elements that probably come in through your HRIS on veteran status, disabilities, anything like that. And then it usually will ideally feed it into an HRIS system. Or I'm an applicant tracking system first, and then moving into HRIS. And most companies sometimes have a lot of gaps in the beginning if they haven't been tracking it. So there has to be a push to start to fill that out. But most companies struggle to kind of get a full robust data set because some employees might just not fill it out, right? Especially in large organizations. Mm-hmm. So seeing what kind of data you have around that first and foremost, and how you can make a push to get those more filled out is up to the company, because some companies might want to require that as a field. Like next time you go into your HRS, you have to fill out this field. Some companies don't want to push for it too hard and just say, hey, I would love it, but if they don't feel comfortable sharing, then that's what it is. As far as overlaying anything else, usually we kind of see a stepping stone system where companies start with gender. It's the most reportable, trackable, and then they might, after 1 or 2 sessions of doing a pay equity analysis from a gender lens, they might layer on something like race. They might do it separately, and they might overlay it with gender, just depending on a lot of times the resources they have that to be able to do this kind of analysis in-house, or the resources they have to be able to outsource it. I haven't seen too much yet on orientation or anything like that coming down the pipe. Usually companies, since most companies, you look at them out there, still aren't necessarily doing a pay equity analysis yet. It's on their road plan or on their roadmap, but they might not have done one yet. So I think that's to come. I suspect more and more companies are going to be more sophisticated and starting to look at that, but it's just not as common yet.
Thank you. Last question. A number of the companies that we've worked with at Gender Ideal are smaller companies, maybe 50 employees or somewhere between 50 and 100. And when we give them the feedback, hey, you haven't done a pay equity analysis and that's on your list of recommendations, we hear, gosh, we don't know. We don't know if we have the right data. We don't know where to get started. We know it's important, but so what would you say to those companies as get started? Here's kind of the minimum effort, but the way to start this process, even though it may, as you've just kind of pointed out, it may be a process that gets more sophisticated over time. But what would your advice be for those small companies that want to do this, don't quite know where to start or how to start?
I think first and foremost, ideally, you have some type of reputable market data that you are comparing your employee population to, because that puts into context, again, the level and the expectations of a role and whether they're similar to other roles and who is in that population that you need to be comparing and who is low and who is not. So that's one. And then, smaller organizations can definitely do a cohort analysis when they're looking at, hey, all these people are level 4 software engineers. What gaps exist? Why might this female be at the lowest mark versus all these males? And just being able to dig into the research, because a lot of times you find that you don't document that very well, and it also has ramifications in your other processes, like whether or not you negotiate an offer processes, how you document negotiations, how you document any pay changes, and the whys behind it. So I think ideally having a market data source and having your employee data clean is going to be the two stepping stones. And then once you start digging into the data, more answers start appearing. That's the hardest part, is like, just look at the data. And once you get to that point, you can start making decisions, or you might have more questions, but at least you have your data organized in order to start to analyze it. So that's ideally the first couple steps.
Well, we are at time. And so, Julia, I just want to say thank you so much. This has been really enlightening. The work that you do has impact on so many people at so many companies across the country and around the globe. So thank you for sharing your wisdom. And thanks, everyone, for joining. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you. Bye.